Before we hear from our economists, it is my pleasure to introduce Cal Wilding, President and CEO of the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA has generously supported this morning breakfast as our title sponsor. Please help me welcome Carol.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Economic Club's annual Outlook Breakfast. Thank you, Stephanie, for organizing this breakfast every year. I think we always say every year it's a particularly important year, but this year it trumps everything. No pun intended. Thank you also to our esteemed panelists for joining us this morning, including a new face, Frances Donald, the new Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at RBC. Have to say, it's great to see another woman there in that role in a very male-dominated field. No offense, guys, but welcome, Frances. So I hope everyone's holidays were quieter than the drama in Ottawa, and the drama is far from over. Throw in the commitment by the opposition to trigger an election at the first opportunity, and 2025 in Canada will be a year that's defined by political uncertainty. The government's entire policy and legislative agenda is on hold for the foreseeable future. And this adds layers of complexity and unpredictability for both investors and businesses. In fact, the Canadian Economic Policy Uncertainty Index has hit levels not seen since the very start of the pandemic. Policy uncertainty is approaching pandemic-era highs on a global scale. And Canada is not alone in the political drama department. Whether it's Germany, Austria, South Korea, or Thailand, governments around the world are mired in a messy, unpredictable, and destabilizing malaise. Then, of course, there's the red baseball cap in the room. And if we are not careful, the political conversation in Canada will be dominated by posts on Truth Social for the next 4 years. After all, that was how President-elect Donald Trump announced his proposed 25% tariff on all goods coming in from Canada. One estimate puts the hit to Canada at between 2 to 3% of GDP. There are over 2 million Canadian jobs exposed to U.S. tariffs, and that includes 1 out of every 7 here in Ontario. It's still an open question whether President-elect Trump will follow through on his threat, or if these tariffs are merely a means to wring concessions out of Ottawa. However, if they are implemented, the economic impact of these tariffs will be felt widely. But trade is not the only issue that will dominate the political conversation in the coming year. Its recent decisions to cut the policy rate by 50 points, the Bank of Canada cited the Trump tariff threat. But we know that other factors weighed heavily too, including sluggish economic growth and a softening labor market. So, as easy as it would be to point fingers at the incoming administration, the economic headwinds for Canada were blowing strong well before the U.S. election. For some time now, Canada's top-line economic growth has been driven not by improvements in our productivity, but by surging population growth. Canada's immigration policy will be front and center in the campaign to come, as will the debate over pocketbook issues, including housing affordability. The challenges we face are deep, entrenched, and decades in the making, and addressing them absolutely should be top priority. But in a year that will be dominated by the soap opera of politics, we cannot take our eye off the ball. Our long-term prosperity as a country and building an economy that can fulfill the promise of a better life for current and future generations. Now, it was in this very room last year that we discussed Canada's weak economic productivity and its impact on our standard of living. Unfortunately, the only thing that's changed since last year is the urgency to address them and our capacity to do so, given the huge question mark that hangs over Ottawa. But we cannot let our competitiveness slip from the top of the political agenda. We need to get serious about our complex tax environment and how we compete for investment dollars. Canada is ranked a lowly 26 out of 38 OECD countries on business tax competitiveness. Canadian businesses face a combined federal-provincial tax burden that's above the U.S. average federal state tax level, and that's before the Trump administration and their pledge to cut business taxes. We need tax policies that will encourage the investments that help drive our productivity and future growth. And that means encouraging investments in our innovation, data-driven knowledge economy. So here's the good news and the success stories that we should celebrate. There are at least 71 Canadian companies in the 100 million club, surpassing the 100 million in annual revenue benchmark and demonstrating sustainable growth. They're the kind of innovative companies that will help lead Canada into the future, but they can't do it without the right policy environment. And that means a growth agenda that encourages entrepreneurs, startups, and scale-ups. However, from Trump's Truth Social post to Trudeau's successor, the debate over Canada's economic productivity is under threat of being drowned out by the noise. So it is up to all of us, as business leaders, industry groups, trade organizations, and yes, our esteemed economists, to make sure that the signal breaks through the noise and make sure that competitiveness, productivity, and economic growth are front and center. Because whoever sets the political agenda for the year ahead will set the economic agenda in Canada for decades to come. And so that's why conversations like this morning that the Economic Club of Canada is hosting are critically important for us. So let's get started, and it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator. She's one of the leading political journalists in the country, CTV News Chief Political Correspondent, Vashi Kapelos.
Hi everyone, great to be here with you on this snoozer of a political week. I hope you're having a good one. And I'm very excited to introduce our panelists, all chief economists with their organization. Avery Schoenfeld is with CIBC Capital Markets. Beata Karanchi is with TD Bank Group. Douglas Porter with BMO. Francis Donald with RBC. And Stéphane Marion with the National Bank of Canada. Come on up. All right, hi everybody. Nice to see you again 1 year later. I wanted to thank you all for laughing when Stephanie called me brilliant. That was really sweet. Okay, so we have to start off with what both Carol and Stephanie mentioned, which is the threat of these looming tariffs, 25% blanket tariff on all Canadian imports. There have been little to no signs that the President of the United States is not going to apply these. There are some ministers who say in recent days they think they can still avoid them. The premiers are talking in a different way.
As you guys are all aware, have a very unique situation politically, domestically right now. I wanted to start off from an economic perspective on a very positive note, Avery, and ask you, if these tariffs are applied, how would you quantify the economic impact on this country's economy?
We actually had a session for our own teams with former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz, and I actually liked what he said about this. He said that anybody who tells you they can quantify the impact of a two-way trade war on the Canadian economy is lying. And to some extent, he's right, in the sense that we can't look back at the last time a 25% tariff was suddenly imposed on the entire country's exports. There was no last time. When you get down to it, each industry will respond very differently. In some cases, we can pass on the tariff. In some cases, in passing it on to the buyer, which is the US, there's a big drop in demand. In other cases, the demand is inelastic and we don't see that. There are cases where the US can quickly substitute for what we produce, and so we would lose a lot of market share in a hurry. But what we do know is, without being able to put a decimal place on this, that the impact is large, in the sense that we can look back at what happened when they put a tariff on steel and aluminum. I think that might have been a 25% tariff. The drop in our steel exports during the 1 year where that took place subtracted about 0.5 point from Canadian GDP. That's one product area. So multiply that across the economy, it's bad. Of course, there are things we can do to respond. We can cut interest rates more. We can provide more stimulus to domestic demand. So we can help the economy recover. We can have the Canadian dollar dip even more to shelter some of those exports. But it's definitely a serious issue, and it warrants all the attention being given. And just by way of comparison, when they were talking about ripping up NAFTA in the first term, we would go to most favorite nations tariffs without NAFTA. They average about 3%. So, and we were worried about that. We were worried more about things like dispute resolution and so on. But we're talking 20%, 25% tariffs. That's enormous.
Beata, premiers collectively and unanimously all say that their provincial economies would immediately enter into a recession. Not in the technical sense, but it would right away start an economic contraction. Are they right?
Yeah, I don't think anybody here would forecast a strong growth year for Canada. Or that's a big strategic call if that's the case. So I think that would be about right because of the high trade reliance. And I think what everybody's trying to understand, you can see what's happening on the political front. The premiers are now trying to front run for the vacuum that's now created at the federal level. And, Trump led us to believe that this was really about border control, but hey, why not just take over the whole country and that solves all your problems, except they don't manage their own border south of them very well. So, the bigger item here that needs to be negotiated is what do we have that they need? And that is always going to come back to our land. And that's why that Canada looks so interesting as well as Greenland and why we're lumped into those two regions. And even though much of the trade irritants are with China and Mexico, they have been largely absent from the trolling that we're getting out of the US, and it's really fallen onto two countries who have massive land mass. Like in Canada, there's only 4 people per square kilometer, so there's more of us here than would fill up a square kilometer, and in Greenland, it's the least densely populated country in the world. So they want the land, they want the minerals, and they want to get us going on it. And so in some respect, as negative as this is from an economic prospect, if we just take a step back and what might come out of this is we've always needed a push in Canada to get going on things that are environmentally sensitive. And this is one avenue that will have to get us thinking more forward-looking about what we can actually put forward. And it's not the promise of critical minerals, because we've had that promise in Canada for decades. It's the delivery of it and it's the action of it. And that's really our only negotiation tool.
So I actually wanted to delve into that a little bit, Doug, and the prospect of what Canada's response looks like should these be applied. There's a very live conversation going on behind the scenes, not just about tariffs on Florida orange juice, but on cutting off the supply of things like critical minerals or oil, or adding a large export tax to them. There's obviously a lot of pushback from premiers of the provinces where much of those natural resources sit, in the case of oil in Alberta and Saskatchewan, or even electricity in Ontario, something Doug Ford has publicly said. What would the impact of that be here?
Well, it would also be negative here in Canada. I mean, almost any reasonable response we would have to 25% tariffs would rebound on us and be painful as well. It's interesting, I had the pleasure of being on a conference call with Canada's main negotiator for the USMCA, Steve Verheuvel, and actually one of his responses was that in a true trade war, one of the things we would look at is putting export taxes on food and energy. Unfortunately, the political reality of that, it's just not going to fly. Alberta, of course, is not going to go along with that. But, perhaps Alberta could go on a month-long maintenance of their entire oil facilities, at a convenient time and, unable to produce any oil or for exports for a month. But this is very serious business. I mean, just getting back and, as much as Avery said, we can't put a number on it. The kind of numbers we are looking at are declines on the order of about 3% of GDP. And when you think, in a best case scenario, we'd be looking at about 2% growth over the next year. This is quite serious business indeed.
What does that translate to when you talk, Francis, about the labor market? Because I think for regular people, when we hear all the back and forth about tariffs, when we hear premiers talk about the possible shedding of millions of jobs, that is, very, very scary thing. What is your assessment of what this might do to the labor market?
Well, it depends on the magnitude as well. So my colleagues here have talked about how difficult that is to quantify. We have to run a variety of scenarios. What if it's just a few select goods? Then it's a few decimal points across a range of indicators. Or if it's as threatened, we have very similar outlook to Doug that this could be multiple years of really sizable pull downs and pronounced recessionary periods. So the labor market follow on to that, nobody in here needs a PhD in economics to know that that's challenging for a labor market that is already in a position of struggling, because the unemployment rate in Canada is rising. We have it going to 7% over the course of the next year. Job vacancies are becoming larger. This is not, a 2018 type of economy. These problems, these threats, these vulnerabilities are hitting Canada at a time when the labor market is softening. The central bank is already having to cut rates pretty aggressively, and potential growth in Canada is collapsing with low productivity. So I think about these shocks a lot like immune systems. So in Canada, if you think about your economic immune system as being your ability to weather a cold. So I have kids in daycare and they come home with colds all the time. I have a really strong immune system. The US economy is in a position of very strong immune system. It has high productivity, AI is going really well, they're not very interest rate sensitive, they've had huge fiscal pushes. Their ability to weather this storm is much bigger than our immune system. Unlike the American immune system, which is like those guys on Venice Beach who are, pumping muscle, we're a little bit more like those kids that eat a lot of junk food and probably watch too much TV. So what worries me is that the shock that's coming through in Canada is occurring in an environment of weakness to start with, and that compounds some of the challenges and the shocks. And that's true for the labor market, but it's also true for a range of other elements. But I just want to emphasize here that we had threats in the prior, or in Trump 45. We had big threats that sound like these ones that didn't actually materialize. So as much as we spend a significant amount of time talking about those threats and the vulnerabilities and the viruses, the daycare shocks that are going to come through, I also think we need to remember that we can simultaneously be building up our economic immune system and not to lose sight of some of these elements that would help us more resilient, because this isn't the last geopolitical shock Canada is going to face. We are in a new era. There will be more daycare colds coming ahead. So keeping that parallel track is going to be very important for Canada in the next few years.
I have a lot of questions about building up that resiliency in just a few moments. But Stéphane, I wanted to get you on this issue as well, because a couple of the conversations I had over the weekend with people involved in speaking to Trump's team, they told me that it had been conveyed to them that it would be possible that upon the announcement of these tariffs, let's say through executive order, that they would be applied 6 months beyond that. So let's say there is, and that's not a guarantee, obviously, like this is just stuff coming from people around Trump. But let's say there is that interim period before the tariffs are applied. Is there a possible economic impact to even the specter of them?
We're going to see the economic impact over the next few months. There will be no business investment in Canada. That's a given. So we're going to have weak growth. Now, in terms of our posture and what we do, I've seen a bunch of politicians arguing this week that it's not their fault. It's everybody's fault, but their fault. But as Francis said, our economy is a stinker to start off with, and that's a made in Canada strategy. We've never seen such a divergence in economic performance between Canada and the US. If you look at the output gap, we've never seen the US operating so much above its speed limit, and Canada so much below its speed limit. Again, that's a made in Canada strategy. So we have a stinker of an economy. We are concerned about American tariffs. 25%, that seems to be a big number, right, Vashi? But you know what the tariff equivalent is on interprovincial trade barriers in Canada? 21%. So why don't we act? Why don't we get our act together and fix that? And that would be a formidable offset to the US, right? So what I'm saying here is this is an opportunity to fix our economy. And I think we have the means to do so. So yes, let's stop blaming the rest of the world. Yes, we have challenges, but we have our own challenges, and it's a key opportunity. It's one in a lifetime opportunity to fix our economy once and for good.
Don't know if you missed it, but there's a task force that's being established to tackle interprovincial trade for the 700th time. I'm just kidding. One more question about I'm not kidding, actually, it has been reestablished, but one more question about not the tariff specifically, but basically Donald Trump, Avery, coming into office, in the economic policy that he has signaled he will pursue in the US. Namely around tax cuts, around abandoning the Inflation Reduction Act, and, quote unquote, drill, baby, drill. I'm wondering in the aggregate what the pursuit of policies like that south of the border might mean for our economy here.
So I think you have to take any election campaign with a bit of grain of salt, first of all. Not everything that's said in a campaign is going to happen. I don't think waiters are going to get tax-free tips, for example. And Congress plays a big role here. So let's not forget that just in the last few weeks, Congress decided and rejected Trump's request to put aside the debt ceiling for 2 years. And so that was a message from Republicans, particularly in his own party, that no, they still want to take debt ceiling seriously. They're not willing to just have tax cuts and let the deficit blow up. So we do have to think a little bit about what Congress is going to approve. Drill, baby, drill, that's a nice slogan. U.S. oil production's at a record high already. And no doubt they will expand some drilling activity and they will lighten up the regulatory burden. I think it's fair to say that given, I didn't put my red tie on today, and I put a blue one on. It's not because I'm joining RBC. Maybe I'm trying to play with the current political environment in Canada, but we do know that, and odds are, if the polls are right, we will also have a government come into Canada that already is leaning towards certainly a lighter regulatory hand on our own energy sector. So there's a spillover there. And I'd say again on things like, for example, renewable power. Trump rails against windmills. But at the same time, there are a lot of Republican states that are getting a lot of that IRA money that have a lot of projects underway. There's a big demand for electric power in the United States. Some of that is going to come from renewable energy. So it's not clear that all these things are going to happen. But one thing I would say is that the trade war in itself, that's not a winner for the U.S. economy. Remember that the U.S. is pretty close to full employment. And essentially, if you put big two-way trade barriers on, the U.S. ends up having to do less of things that it's good at, where it exports those things, and more of things that it's not as good at, which is why it's importing them. So overall, the U.S. has had tremendous productivity growth, putting a big barrier on two-way trade, if it involves not just Canada, but Europe, Mexico, and so on, is going to end up reallocating American labor in a way that is less productive. So again, that's why I think some of us, any card-carrying economist is typically not a fan of big trade barriers. And that gives us, if we do have that 6-month window in which to try to fend this off, it'll be trying to reach out to people in the administration, in Congress, in state governments to try to make that case that this is not a winner for the U.S. either. And by the way, we may offer to rename the Canada Goose the America Goose, because I think that Trump shows some interest in that, given that it's going to be the Gulf of Mexico. Or actually, someone told me it's the Gulf of Mexico to play into Trump's sports. So there's certainly an interest in, if we have 6 months to make a deal, that would be certainly much more encouraging than tariffs go on right away.
My understanding, though, Bieta, is that when the case was made by ministers at Mar-a-Lago that a trade war hurts everyone, the response from the new Commerce Secretary was, but it'll hurt you guys a lot more.
Yeah, I think, what Trump says in terms of, hey, we're going to put tariffs on you because we want you to make sure that you allocate your resources and time to border security, whether it's people flow or drug flow or whatever the case. Part of that, when it comes to Canada, is smokes and mirrors, right? Their bigger objective is to reduce reliance on China. China has them on a bended knee when it comes to the dependence that they have on the rare earths, critical minerals, and pharma products. And they know it. They haven't attacked China to the same degree that they've attacked other countries who are technically allies. So the objective of what they're trying to do, we can sit there and put all our resources, and Ontario announced OPP officers on the border, and Alberta announced it and put an 18-month plan on, but we're still hearing it. We're still hearing tariffs. It's not going to be enough, because what we ultimately have to do is think through the structure of our economy and look at our competitive advantage, what we have that they don't, and move our economy in that way. And I think that's what Stefan is ultimately getting at. Trade has been built on a comparative advantage. hey, you can make this part better than me, and I can make that part better than you, and you can do this a little cheaper, and I can do that a little cheaper. But there's nothing stopping the US from building a car from beginning to end. They can do it. It requires the restructuring of their labor market. It would lead to higher end user costs, but there's nothing stopping them from doing that ultimately if you give it enough time. They can't come up with rare earths and critical minerals, farmer products, and other factors like they can get out of Canada or Greenland and others. Now keep in mind, Canada only has about 1 to 2% of these in global reserves, identified reserves, but we produce 0 on rare earths. And we don't need to produce enough to supply the whole world, we just need to produce enough to provide it to one country. And so that's where we need to get our mindset. Like we have to do elements to appease the president, but at the same time, don't lose this opportunity to pivot your economy towards your competitive advantage, as opposed to just try to keep up the comparative side of the economy, because that's going to be a losing strategy in the long term, because there's nothing to stop the next president, and the next one, and the next one from continuing with these tactics. You have to have something they need. Energy is a really good one. The only reason we have a trade surplus with the US is because of oil and gas, and the Trans Mountain Pipeline has inflated that even more because it's getting shipped to the coast, getting shipped down the coast to the west, and then they are re-exporting it. And so we know that they have a high dependence on energy. So it goes back to like, what's our structure, what's our competitive advantage, and it goes back to things that we have been denying in our structure for years, which is our resources and lands and the regulations and how much we've hampered ourselves. Like, I understand my structure of my body, right? I was a week in Dominican Republic. I do not sit in the sun. I come out 2 colors, white or red. I'm a Canadian flag. That's it, right? I'm the only person who goes out at 7 in the morning to get that 1 chair under the 1 palm tree on the beach. That's me. Right? And I think in Canada, we have to understand we have huge advantages that they want, and that's why we're getting the attacks. We need to think through big ideas of whoever's the future political leader, not just on removing the interprovincial trade barriers, but where do we move so that we actually have something that the rest of the world cannot make, cannot produce, and we've got it. And it's all under our grounds.
Well, that leads us perfectly into domestic policy and maybe a little politics. There was just a bit of that this week. And a quick reminder, if you have questions for our economists, the number to text is up there. And for the last 20 minutes or so, I'll pose your questions to them. Doug, on Monday, Justin Trudeau quit as leader of the Liberal Party. You may have noticed. He'll stick on as PM until his replacement is chosen, which I think will happen around the beginning of March. Though the rules and formalities of that have yet to be set, but probably will any minute now. What is Justin Trudeau's economic legacy? It's an easy one.
So just so everyone knows, we did not know the questions ahead of time. And oh, look at the time. We're almost out of time.
It's 46 minutes left.
So let's face it, you know, the entire world went through a brutal pandemic, which led to inflation globally. So I don't think we can really pin that and the big run up in interest rates. I think that when we look back over the last 10 years, we have had a dreadful productivity performance, as Stefan alluded to. Some of that is the denominator, just the fact that we had some of the fastest population growth that we have seen in our history in the last 10 years, and it exploded in the last 3 years. We added 3 million people in the last 3 years, and I do think that that did play some role in the weakness that we've seen in productivity, and the flip side of that has been the absolutely horrendous housing affordability issue we've been left with, and I think some of that is his legacy. But you will also recall in 2015, with great fanfare, he talked about running a $10 billion deficit to kickstart the economy, and then it would be balanced within 4 years. I am not going to blame the run-up in the deficit during the pandemic on the Liberals. That happened, as I said, around the world. But there's clearly been some weakening of our fiscal anchors in the last 10 years. It's interesting when we look back at the bigger picture, though, the debt to GDP went from about 30% of GDP before to just a wee bit more than 40% now, which is not a horrendous, it's unfortunate, but it's not a horrendous deterioration that we've seen in the fiscal side. But you know, this year's budget deficit has been revised up by 10 billion. You know, I mean, you know, when we think back about that initial effort to kickstart the economy, it's you know, obviously we've lost our fiscal rectitude and discipline over the past 10 years, and that may well be one of the biggest changes or legacies of the past 10 years. But I actually would say you know, the single thing that really stands out to me is the very aggressive immigration policy we've had in the past 10 years and what that's done for both positive and negative.
Yeah, I have more questions about immigration because if any of you were here last year, I feel like all of you collectively kind of prompted the discussion that ended up taking place and ultimately massive, you know, policy changes that took about 10 months to actually fully be announced. But what a different world we are in from a policy perspective in that area now than we were exactly a year ago. Francis, Justin Trudeau's replacement asks you for a meeting and says, how do we, you know, what's the one or two main things I have to do in order to build this country's immune system? What do you say?
It's not one or two things. Of course, the economists are asked a lot of political questions. We're not sitting in Ottawa and have all the answers to these, and we're also asked to fix things. So I think we're probably better at diagnosing the issues than we are in necessarily always giving a very precise treatment. But several of the problems that we see in Canada are decades in the making. The productivity decline has been happening for 40 years as it comes down. And so the simple answer to that question is, well, we got to increase productivity, but then there's the big how attached to it. And what's fascinating to me is that we know productivity is weak. We know that we're just not as good as we used to be at creating things and building things and generating output. But if you look across this country, and when I speak to my clients, the reasons for that tend to be very different sector by sector, region by region, province by province. And so when I'm asked this question, I often feel the same way as when I look at my house and I realize that every room is messy and where the heck are you going to start? And the advice you get is start in one corner. Clean one corner at a time and build your way out. So there's a lot of little corners that we could work on. I think interprovincial trade barriers, as Stéphane mentioned, is a hugely important one. I think we need to think about the role of energy that exists. I think we can do a lot on red tape, regulatory, how long it takes to get, for example, just the construction permits. We need to be building housing supply. This is the single biggest thing, in my view, that needs to happen urgently and immediately. But at this point, I don't even care which one we start with. Let's get into one corner of the house and start cleaning. I think importantly, and we're talking a lot about what tariffs do in 2025 and 2026, but the economic conversations now are longer term because we aren't going to fix. I didn't use the same terms that Stéphane used, but the challenges that exist, the stinker of an economy, doesn't get fixed in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. This is probably a lengthy adjustment that will take us a while to get through. And I think that's important for us as Canadians to understand. It's very common for me to give a presentation about Canada and then for someone to say to me, but what's the good news? And I want to give that because there's so many beautiful things about this country that I love, that we all love. We know we're incredibly well educated, high human capital. We have resources. We have access to the Arctic. We have all the tinder it takes to make a fire. This all exists, but we also have to take a moment if we're operating businesses and we're operating as Canadians to have an honest conversation about the state of play as to where we're in now and have a very adult conversation about how long it's going to take us to remedy multiples of these problems. There is no quick fix is effectively what I'm saying, but of course we could give you a long list of things to start with. Those are a few that I would look at.
Stéphane, in layman's terms, why, in your view, is the economy a stinker? And do you agree with the assessment that there's no quick fix?
You've been asking a lot of questions this morning. Let me ask you one. Are we a trading nation, in your opinion?
Yes.
What do we trade?
What do we export?
Yeah.
A lot of stuff. Car parts, oil.
We have it. We're trading energy. That's it. Our non-energy surplus is non-existent. It's a deficit of 5%. Why is that? We have the smallest manufacturing sector in the G7. Our strategy over the past 20 years has been, let's decarbonize by sending our pollution to the rest of the world. We've just outsourced production to the rest of the world because manufacturing output is higher than the rest of the world. Now I ask you again, If you sign a free trade agreement, and all my colleagues say we have to use a comparative advantage, surely Vashi would say, well, if I sign a free trade agreement, it's to grow my manufacturing sector according to my comparative advantage. It's not to have the atrophy that we're seeing in manufacturing right now, where manufacturing on a per cap basis is down 30% over the past 20 years, while the US is up 10%. Figure that out. So what do we trade? So, not that I like him, but when the US President-elect the other says, well, what do we need from Canada? What do they have that I need? Given the size of our manufacturing sector, we've made ourselves irrelevant in the North American supply chain. So we do have capability to rebuild that, but that's a key corner, like Francis was alluding to corners. So why don't we make ourselves the best retaliation against American? We will be the most interesting place to invest. We have energy. If you're going to do manufacturing, well, you need natural gas. 34% of the energy consumed in manufacturing is natural gas. The other one is electricity, 30%. We have the cheapest natural gas in the world and the cheapest electricity in the world. Why don't we use this as this opportunity to rebuild our manufacturing sector? But yes, I agree, it will be more pollution, but it's better that this pollution be here with more decent energy than sending it and having manufacturing built on coal as it is in Asia right now. So that's how we bring back our comparative advantage. We have the resources. You're going to do manufacturing, you do resources. What I take offense this morning is that I have Singapore and Malaysia coming into a trade deal this morning announcing that if you do want to do manufacturing in Malaysian first, you're going to have 5% corporate tax for the next 15 years. If you want to do AI over there, it's also going to be 5%. That wipes out a comparative advantage by having countries that have no comparative advantage using that posture. So, no, we can't have a capital gains inclusion that goes up in April. You can't do that. That was a budget that was designed in April before we knew the outcome of the US election. We have to adapt to that situation. We have to be the most interesting place to invest in North America, and we can do that. And that's important.
And I think, Vashi, I just want to add, when we talk about how, we're in this very challenging environment and there's a long list of things that need to get done, it's not from an area of hopelessness. It's not saying, oh my gosh, there's so much work to do, we should be so overwhelmed. It's that there are so many things that can be done that can help incrementally move. There's no one quick fix, but there's an extremely long list that this panel, when I was an audience member, have talked about for years as being incrementally helpful. This is going to be a block by block rebuild, with some blocks being quite a little bit bigger, such as the ones that Stefan is mentioning.
I want to quickly ask Avery about what you referenced a few minutes ago with your blue tie, that there is likely, according to public opinion polling, going to be a change in government, in that the Conservatives will be in power. Have you heard anything from them that you can discern would amount to economic policy? Like, are there, you talked about, less regulation. We've heard about spending cuts, for example, though no specifics at this juncture, just that they're studying what they can cut. What sort of picture can you paint for people who are here today of what we might be in for if the Conservatives win, from an economic perspective?
So I think I remember the slogan, wasn't it? Cut the crime, axe the tax, a few things out of the rhyme, bring it home. So what is there behind that? There are some details. So clearly there is, if you listen carefully, and I listened to, I think it was an hour and a half interview that he did online, not with CTV, but he should have. But what he did talk about was, he did talk about being conservative in the traditional sense of believing in smaller government. So it's clear there's an emphasis on going beyond just closing the English language CBC, but, paring back some of the size of government, not specifically, right? There's no specifics there. I don't think that involves a fiscal contraction or a big drag on the economy, because at the same point, he's also talking about, relieving Canadians of some of the tax burden. So, even on the deficit, I know some of my colleagues are saying, oh, Trudeau's lost control of the deficit and so on. Let's not forget that this year's deficit, the government's estimate is 1.6% of GDP. The US federal deficit is running at over 6% of GDP. So actually, by the standards of Europe, the US, we're doing quite well on that. And even if the government, a new government promises to balance the budget typically they'll make a promise like that over our 5-year term, we'll balance the budget. Well, that's only subtracting a few decimal places from GDP each year. So I don't think it's an austerity government because they pare back spending. They also will relieve us on some taxes. The other clear focus has been on the energy sector, not just the carbon tax, but the regulatory burden on new projects and so on. So it's clear there's a lightening there. On housing, that's fair to say the Liberals are throwing a lot of money on trying to get support municipalities with infrastructure and so on that's necessary to build housing. The Conservatives have a different approach as to who's going to get money. So both governments planning on doing that. I think the Conservatives will carry through with reducing population growth for a couple of years. So some of it is similar. But by and large, the biggest sectors that you can point to and say things are going to change a bit, I think, is energy resources, lightening the regulatory burden. And, it's typical for a Canadian opposition party. When you're winning, don't provide too many details. So we'll get the details after an election in probably early May. But I think generally speaking, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And I would agree with what Francis said. There's no quick fix, right? It's not as if, and Canada, by the way, is not the only country that's looking at U.S. productivity numbers and saying, what's wrong with us? All of Europe is saying that too. So this productivity miracle has been AI, big developments in corporate sector U.S. that other countries have not been able to keep pace with. We're in the same boat. And hopefully, I agree with Francis. I think that if we start one little bit at a time, we can fix some of that. But it's all going to be a lot more difficult if we're behind a big tariff wall.
Actually, can I ask a question,
Yes, you can.
Avery? Name me one big energy producer in the world that has a productivity problem. Europeans are not energy producers. Name me one.
So, we don't have a productivity problem. We just haven't been growing the sector. We have basically put and that was Canadians, let's not forget, okay, those of us in the room here, this was Canadians' political choice. If you go back and you look at the last few elections and you say, why did the Liberals win those elections, or at least win a minority government? One big reason was that voters decided that what Scherer and other Conservative leaders were offering in terms of containing Canada's carbon emissions wasn't enough. Certainly Ontario and Quebec voters, not Alberta voters, I'm sure, but we're still voting largely on that. And so it does take a change in political sentiment to shift that. And one unfortunate thing that's happening for the climate is we can see that the U.S. is going to make much less effort in that direction. And it may well be that Canadian voters decide, if the Americans aren't pulling their weight, that maybe we won't pull as much of that burden either. So it's up to Canadian voters to decide the balance between, do we want more oil sands plants or do we want to cap future activity in order to meet some defined carbon emissions goal? That was what voters...
I have to come to the defense of Canadians in this room. Yes, I think Canadians have high consciousness on environmental policy. When you come out and say we're going to have a carbon tax, that's different than when you say, oh, now we're going to have an emissions cap. Now we're going to contain methane. Now we're going to make a decision on whether a project can be greenlit or not, which Alberta challenged and subsequently got changed. That is a layering of regulation that is completely unnecessary. Pick a lane and stick with it, and it creates business uncertainty. If you look at Norway, also an energy-producing country, this year in the papers, they reported that almost 100% of their vehicle sales were EV, in 2024. Clearly a milestone that we won't be at probably for over a decade. They also have a carbon tax, and they're within the EU, so they also work within the trading system, but it's one or the other. And they are more mindful of that impact as it filters through the downstream. And I think where we lost our way is we just thought more was better. We did it with immigration, and we did it here on climate policy. And I think there's an aspect where you can roll back regulation without losing sight that you're still environmentalists and you're still doing aspects that are beneficial for the economy in the long term, for the citizens in the long term, and for the land. But you have to do it in a smart way. And I think what we've seen in the last decade is we've just seen too much layering. It's the same problem we see in other sectors of Canada with regulation. We have too many conflicting policies. It frustrates businesses. You can see it in our entry rates of businesses. We have a falling dynamism, which is a greater rate of exits of businesses than entry. It's happening particularly in the manufacturing sector with companies that are between 100 and 499 employees. That's really important. That's your missing middle. They don't get to be big, right? And they don't get to be that powerhouse on the economic scale, even for employment. And so we really have to start thinking like, we have gone full hog in so many areas that we need to dial those back. And we talk about cleaning corners of the house. That has to be a priority, but that has to go across every industry. So you can't just do it in one industry. We have to have a mindset of really tackling this across the country in every industry.
Stefan, I think you want to jump in. I just quickly would say that I do think, though, to Avery's point, that the Liberals did signal to voters that they would place a primacy on reducing emissions. I agree that they didn't necessarily say we're going to do X, Y, Z, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that there was a message that we have a plan, a more robust plan, and the alternative does not. And that at the time, in 2021 and 2019, it resonated enough. I don't think that issue, if you look at all public opinion polling right now, resonates in the same way that it did 4 years ago. And to that effect, I interviewed the energy minister last night, who's considering running, the man who has defended the emissions cap for the last number of years, who's considering running for the leadership, who now says he would consider another tool.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I think that's,
Stefan,
I would agree with you.
Yes,
Exactly.
I'm just going to
There's
get
been a
Stefan to
voter
jump in.
change.
Yeah, Stefan, go ahead.
First of all, Avery, you didn't answer my question, so you're ready for politics. You didn't give me one country. Now, Beata, the good people of Norway, the beautiful
Slovenia.
people of Norway,
I
they
don't
just
know.
announced yesterday that they exported a record amount of natural gas last year, and they're going to drill this year another 40 wells in the Northern Sea, and they will flare the world with methane emissions, which we don't do in Canada, and methane is 80 times worse than CO2 emissions. So that's the good people of Norway's way. And they sell their gas at world price, well, we said at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, which is the cheapest thing in the world. So who puts a carbon tax under these circumstances? What are we willing to achieve? What are we going to achieve? We're not selling our natural gas to the rest of the world like Norway's doing. So I totally disagree with that model, because they'll give you $20,000 a year to buy an electrical vehicle, so no wonder that they're fully electric. But they announced 4 weeks ago that they're considering curtailing their exports to Europe because they have issues in producing electricity. So that's so much for the Swedish model, Norwegian model, which is always quoted as a model of productivity. They leverage the resource sector to make themselves look better, and we don't do that. Now, to your question, to your electoral platform, I agree with Avery. It was a choice made by Canadians in 2015 when the world was a different place. At this point in time, we don't have the same friends that we did in 2015. So where I critique the current government is they've never been able to adapt to a changing geopolitical environment. So that pledge in 2015 doesn't hold in 2022, in my opinion.
Let's move a little bit. We have about 5 minutes left before I start taking your questions, so please continue sending them in. Doug, I wanted to ask about, when it comes to evolving policies, the subject of much of our discussion last year, and that's around immigration. Since we talked about it, massive changes on the temporary side, but also on the permanent side. A few months ago, the minister announced a 20% cut to the permanent targets moving forward. We talked about it in an affordability context last year. What do you think the impact of those policy changes over the long term will be on growth?
Not that big. So I think we should be very clear here what we're looking at on the immigration front over the next year. If they hit their targets, and that's a huge if, we'd be looking at roughly zero population growth over the next couple of years. But I would see that just as a counter to the excesses of the past couple of years. If you average it out over 4 years, we're still looking at population growth of about 1.5% per year, which is above our long-run average. And over the short term, I'm just not in the camp that believes this is going to lead to big contraction in the economy. There's zero correlation between population growth and economic growth over the short term. Over the longer term, yes, obviously the size of your labor force is a key building block of your economic growth. But over the short term, I think it's not that big of a driver. And I believe that whoever is in power within a couple of years, we're going to be back to relatively healthy inflows of immigration, probably on the line of 1 to 1.5% of our population. So I don't see this as a long-term structural issue. I think, or structural change. I think it's really just a response to the excesses of the past couple of years. If I may, I'd just like to say something. We've heard a lot of negativity on the economy. A stinker, for instance. I would just point out that Canada is one of the most interest-sensitive economies in the world. We have very high levels of household debt. It turns over relatively quickly. We have just had the most aggressive interest rate cuts in the world in the last year. I would say, were it not for the tariff risk, we would actually be looking at a relatively optimistic outcome for the Canadian economy over the next couple of years, is that huge burden of the high interest rates gets lifted off the Canadian consumer. The reason why we have underperformed the U.S. to such a degree is because of that interest sensitivity, which is now we're on the other side of it and going in the opposite way. So I realize this is a bit like saying, you know, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln, you know, outside of the tariffs, but I actually do think the outlook for the economy was relatively bright at this point.
It is also worth noting that productivity is correlated with the speed of the economy. When the economy is sluggish, and I would agree with Doug, the sluggishness the past couple of years has been deliberate. It was to raise interest rates to slow the Canadian economy. When the economy is sluggish, the waiter is serving half as many tables because the restaurant isn't full. The other businesses are not operating at full tilt, and you tend to get weaker output per hour. So actually, part of improving productivity is just cutting interest rates, getting businesses to do more capital spending with lower interest rates, getting those restaurants and so on more full. You get more output per hour from both of those things. So we will have a recovery there. And that's why when you look at Europe, for example, you know, they also slowed their economy. They've also had bad productivity growth, and we would expect to see some improvement there. So, you know, it is true that we've been on a doom and gloom thing. We didn't want to spoil your whole breakfast. But the reality is that if we don't get tariffs, I think all of our forecasts were that prior to that risk, that the Canadian economy was going to do better. And we don't need all those foreign workers. We've got 6.8% unemployment. So we've got a lot of Canadians who are looking for jobs now.
I actually did, Francis, want to ask you about the trajectory for interest rates, and I acknowledge, obviously, with the threat of tariffs, that that's a complicated prediction to make right now. But this time last year, again, we were all on the edge of our seats wondering how many cuts, when the cuts would start, all that kind of stuff. We obviously did see a successive number of them throughout the year. Where do you see the bank going this year?
Well, the bank isn't done. That's pretty clear. We know that we'll probably be getting more rate cuts, but they've intimated that they maybe not be as large as what we've seen, or they may have a different frequency. So we at RBC, we see 5 more 25 basis point cuts. I think that's probably one of the more aggressive calls, seeing the Bank of Canada ending at 2%. Could it be 2.25%? Sure. Based on the information that we have now, our view is that there's a little more easing that has to happen to relieve some of this burden that exists. And I think what my colleagues are highlighting is really important for the general Canadian public to recognize, which is there's a very big difference between the cyclical factors that are driving Canada on a year-to-year basis and the structural ones. And that's why I use the example of the immune system. The immune system is, what is your general state of being on a permanent basis? And we all agree up here that it's pretty weak. And then you have these shocks that come into the system, and it's your ability to be resilient or not. We had this very sizable interest rate shock. Think of that like the bad cold, and we're really getting over that. This is such a really critical point that I think just about everyone here had a re-acceleration or is feeling better about the second half of 2025 because of those rate cuts. Now, this is where forecasting gets a bit tricky. My forecast would change if I reduce the amount of rate cuts that are involved, because I'd say, well, actually, that's not going to be as supportive as growth as we would think. So there's an interplay between it. For most Canadians, I think the story is that there will be more rate cuts. It will not go down forever. We are not going back to 0% unless we get a sizable big new shock, something like tariffs, but a reasonable base case. And there are always changes to that. A reasonable base case, from our point of view, is that we get closer to 2, maybe a little bit above 2, depending on some of the evolving factors with inflation.
Okay, we've got audience questions now. Please do keep texting them in. And now you get to see what they are. They're right there. Beata, I'll start with you. If you were providing advice to the next Prime Minister of Canada relating to economic policy, what would your top 3 pieces of advice be?
Start over on the tax system. Our tax system is atrocious. It's overly burdened, it's overly layered. We pick and choose industries on corporate taxes and subsidies and credits, and our income tax rates are extremely high and discouraging of high net worth and entrepreneurs. I think the best thing that came out of the Perot government is that you know, the increase in the inclusion rate of the capital gains tax got shelved, and hopefully.
CRA says it's still going to.
Yeah, but if there's an election, it's a done deal, and that is one huge complaint I've been hearing when I talk to clients, especially those who are entrepreneurs or looking to do startups where you know, most of your income is coming off of capital gains through the growth of companies, and we obviously have this big problem already in Canada. So going back to your point of like how many times have we done assessments of interprovincial rules? Well, the income tax and the corporate tax is another one of these, right? Like it's a 10-year study, and I think they need to say, you know, let's do a review over the next 6 to 12 months and let's get ourselves in a competitive state, because going back to the structure of the economy, we are a very small country in the grand scheme of the world, and we live next to a behemoth. And so as much as we don't want to compare ourselves to the US due to the unique advantages they have, that is our biggest trading partner. And it's not sufficient to have a tax structure that is equivalent to their tax structure. You have to get more competitive and create a compelling reason of why you would choose Canada, in light of the fact that you might have political risks to deal with the US that can block trade at any moment. You have to create a compelling reason on why Canada is greater. And it can't just be based on your immigration and population policy, because that's really easy to turn the dial in the US, and they're having those conversations with Elon Musk and others, right? So we have to, I think, really have some big thought and thinks on that front. And then I would go after where we've overly layered regulation. And, you know, and Stefan likes to argue with me, but we actually weren't arguing. We agree on the same point. On my point on Norway, the reason they got EVs as high as they did was because of large subsidies, to show you there's a number of ways you can get a policy outcome. One, by putting a gun to the head of the industry. Another one, by incenting people in a positive way. And yes, it costs you money. Personally, I think many people would rather get the money to put towards EVs than to a Christmas tree. This is just my thought, right? $1 billion towards, you know, that HST, $6 billion in you know, money, 200, which got
I
canceled.
don't think those checks are coming out anywhere.
Yeah, but I'm saying that was an idea that was combined $6 billion, and there was much better use for that money, and there's something that would be much more productive and positive for the country. And I think we have to start thinking of the value add of every tax dollar going into this economy, as opposed to just free money to spend or vote-getting money. So I would start with the tax structure and the regulatory structure.
Anyone else want to answer that question? Stefan?
Can I take the capital gains one?
Go for it.
No?
Yeah, someone else had asked about what I think.
Can
sort
you
of your
ask it?
assess-
It's got to come back. But
Yeah, it's a,
okay. I don't
capital
wanna do-
gains changes,
I'm
and
gonna
if
do a
it'll
little-
come into effect.
Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of advertisement on this one. The CDL, I really like the CDL. They put out a great paper this morning signed by Jack Mintz. Do you know the industries that are being hit the hardest by the capital gains inclusion rate? We need to build homes.
Tell us.
Construction. We have a shabby manufacturing sector. Manufacturing gets hurt again. So all the sectors that we need to drive our growth in the next 6 months are being hit by that capital gains inclusion rate. We need to scrap it now. We don't have to wait for a new prime minister to say that. It was a mistake to have this in the last budget. We were assuming that another party would be elected in the US. Not the case anymore. I'm changing my mind. That has to be done. You want to build a data center in Canada right now? We're 50% cheaper than the US in natural gas. But with the carbon tax, we're more expensive. We have a carbon tax in Canada, but our big trading partner doesn't have one. I want to reduce CO2 emissions now, but I'm not going to send those data centers to Malaysia and Singapore. Why would they not be in Canada? But economically, they don't make sense because of the carbon tax. So how do you go about rebuilding your economy if you can't even react to global events and change your mind?
If the full extent, Avery, of 25% tariffs are announced, where do you see the Canadian dollar settling?
A lot weaker. So we've seen
Already pretty
actually,
weak.
now just to make a point, the Canadian dollar has been weakening, but actually that's not really been the story since the lead up to and the election of Donald Trump. What's actually happening is the US dollar is strengthening against all the major trading partners. And in fact, our currency has actually not been the worst. And what that's really telling you is that if you do get into a two-way trade war, much to Donald Trump's chagrin, actually, one of the consequences will be that the US dollar gets pushed higher, and that therefore the ability of the U.S. to actually run a smaller trade deficit gets rapidly diminished. In the end, basically, the exchange rate does some of the moving. Now, that's not a happy consequence. You know, if I told you the Canadian dollar is going to be 150 or 155, it's always going to depend on a number of factors, but it's certainly going to be substantially weaker. That does help cushion our exports, but let's not forget, it makes us poorer, right? When we want to import things, we can afford less. So this is an adjustment. It's part of the adjustment that we would see is a weaker exchange rate to help cushion the blow on our exports. And we would likely have maybe more interest rate cuts than Francis was talking about to help stir up domestic demand to replace those exports. But all of those things, you know, to some extent, there's negatives for all of them. But a weaker Canadian dollar would be pretty much a given. So what you've seen really is the market pricing in some odds that this is happening. That's why the dollar has moved. But I don't know what odds. I think actually it's interesting when you poll U.S. investors on various issues, they tend to believe, maybe it's wishful thinking, that all the things they liked about Donald Trump's electoral platform are going to happen. So lower corporate tax rates, lighter regulation, more oil drilling, all that's going to happen. If you ask Americans, what about big tariffs and all the disruptions that would cause, they tend to say, oh, well, that's not going to happen. So we certainly have not fully priced in the impact of a 10 or 20 or certainly 25% tariff. So pick 150 something Canadian dollars to the US dollar, something like that, entirely plausible in a high tariff scenario where the Bank of Canada has to cut rates more and where our trade flows initially slow, so we have fewer people buying Canadian dollars to buy our cars and so on. All of that is just a weaker Canadian dollar. And the good news is you'll still be able to get a good deal on a vacation in Mexico.
But not in Florida.
I think actually this is an extraordinarily important question, and it goes to something this we've been talking today about the trade theory that we all grew up on and how we think about tariffs. This is not how the new U.S. administration thinks about tariffs. And President Trump, or President-elect Trump, has a new lead of his economic advisory who's written plenty of papers, might be why he's in his position now, that says, well, in 2018, we didn't see inflation in the United States on imports that were tariffed because the U.S. dollar strengthened very much. So there's an embedded theory that is going through Washington that as long as there's a strong U.S. dollar, we get all of the benefits in America of the tariffs and reduced of the negative impacts that come through. That might not be what this group would necessarily agree on, but that is the rationale. And if you go back and you listen to President Trump in Chicago, he talked about how much he loved tariffs, and he received pushback from the Bloomberg editor-in-chief, I think. Well, that's not how tariffs work. And he said, well, I reject the way that tariffs have been described. So sometimes I go see clients in the US and I'll say, well, tariffs have impacts in three ways. First, we see inventory hoarding. So you know the price is going to go up on something, you bring in tons of inventories, boosts growth. Then you see the price increase, then you see the demand shock, so growth declines. And they'll say, no, because there's a fourth step, which is that manufacturing comes home to America. We haven't seen evidence of that. But when we talk a lot about these tariffs and their impact, I think a lot of conversations focus on what's the immediacy, what happens in 2025. But it seems to me that the American economic theory around them is more long-term. It's focused on, we know there are consequences in the short term, but they can be mitigated by things like FX. They can be mitigated if we focus on the long haul. So the US dollar question and its implications for other things, I think will be a really important theme for 2025.
Doug, we've got a question here. What role do you think gold or crypto might play in the future, considering the focus on both assets by key players of the new U.S. administration?
Do I seriously have to answer the crypto question?
Yes.
You're getting all the good questions.
Yeah, I know.
Poor Doug today.
By the way, I just want to say my blue tie has no political connotations. I happen to work for BMO, of course. Yes, so crypto was one of the big winners in the wake of the election, as was the U.S. dollar, by the way. It's interesting that crypto's taken a big step back, though, as U.S. bond yields have risen in the past few weeks. You know, there are some downsides to what Mr. Trump has suggested for the economy, and one concern is, look, Avery touched on it, he's coming into it with a $2 trillion budget deficit. there really is not much room to work on that side. And I think investors occasionally are showing some flashes of concern about the size of that budget deficit. And we're seeing the 10-year Treasury yield in the U.S. forging back up towards 5% at this point. That's bad news for all risk assets, including crypto, by the way. And meanwhile, we're also seeing a real sell-off in UK gilts as well, UK bonds at this point. So I think that could be one limiter for the Trump agenda, is the bond market that could rebel. It's very interesting that even as the Fed has cut by 100 basis points in the last few months, we've actually seen long-term U.S. bond yields rise to almost their highest of the cycle. Last point I'll make, by the way, again, we've been so gloomy on Canada. It's a very different story in Canada. We're actually looking at record spreads versus the U.S. at this point in the bond market. So in other words, the government of Canada can borrow your money for 10 years for 3.3% versus almost a 5% 10-year Treasury yield at this point. That is a ginormous spread. I mean, for decades, the shoe used to be on the other foot. In other words, Canada had to pay more than a percentage point above and beyond what the U.S. paid for long-term money, and it's completely flipped, which I suppose longer term could be considered good news from a Canadian perspective.
So lately, Stéphane, the incoming president, hasn't just been talking about tariffs, he's been talking about annexing Canada. He called the border the other day artificial, said that he would use economic force. Our next question is in relation to that. Would an arrangement where borders are erased, like in Europe, be beneficial for Canada? Why would we not enter one of that type of arrangement with the U.S.?
I just told you before, we have a 24% tariff equivalent between the provinces.
21, you said.
21, yeah. So how do you enter Schengen? You're pretty good. You're exceptional. Is that what she said? Carol called you exceptional. No, so that wouldn't work from a Canadian perspective. I mean, the setup is completely different. Structurally, that doesn't work. What Doug said before, I mean, this is the first bear steepener for financial markets in fixed income market in over 30 years. There's a lot of people in the industry have never seen a bear steepener. I think that will discipline the president so we don't have to even think about the Schengen area with the Americans. Do you have kids?
Yes.
Yeah, how long do you want to keep them at home?
Forever.
Okay, well, not everyone's
I'm
like
Greek.
you.
We have a sick arrangement with that kind of stuff. I hope he never leaves.
You know what the median age is for first-time home buyers in the U.S. right now? 38. You want to keep your kids as long as that?
I mean, I do, but I understand your point.
So Donald Trump was elected to cater to his base, which is the middle class. You want to keep your kids at home for that long. That number is up 6 years from pre-COVID levels. So what Doug is saying about long-term rates moving higher, that means that even though the Fed is cutting rate, the 30-year mortgage rate is rising in the U.S. That will upset many people in the U.S. So, and if it continues to rise, well, by the time Donald Trump comes to office on January 20th, the market will be down 10%. So here's my short-term forecast. Stock market down 10% by the time Donald Trump arrives. I think that will buy us a little bit more time before the tariffs are impacting the rest of the world.
Okay, some positive news. Stéphane's point makes me, Avery, think of one thing that we haven't addressed yet. We've kind of talked a little bit around it, housing and affordability, which again at this time last year was, I mean, it continues to be a massive issue, but it was at the forefront of public discourse. There's some questions from the audience about, more questions about interest rate cuts. I wondered what your assessment of housing and housing affordability, or even just access to the market right now is.
So mortgage rates have come down, and I think they will come down further. The problem is that with a given supply of housing, you create more potential buyers. You don't really improve affordability because prices start drifting up again. So I think all political parties have finally sort of gotten onto the idea that giving a check to a first-time home buyer and doing anything that gives money in the people's pockets just bids up the price of housing, that it's really all about incenting supply. And the good news is that we will, in the next federal election, have two political parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, two major parties at least, both focused on things related to supply. So that's a good thing. What I would say is that we also have to work on some of the other details here, because we've got development charges, we have building codes and very intricate building codes. You know, one of the worst productivity sectors, by the way, in Canada is construction. Output per hour in construction has been steadily going down. And part of that may be the regulatory burden and so on that slows activity. So we need to do all of those things, and we are slowing population growth. So actually, I think we do have a fighting chance of making affordability a little bit better in the sense that prices don't suddenly rebound, even though interest rates have come down, because we do make a bigger effort on supply. One problem we face is that part of our supply is condos. And anyone who knows what's happened in the condo market in Toronto in the last year knows that they're not selling like hotcakes these days. Let's just put it that way. So we've got all those signs around the city everywhere, condo coming, but there's no one actually walking into the showrooms. And because we sell them before we build them, it means that at least next year we won't be building many. So it's probably a 2026 story before we really see that multiple unit construction pick up. We do need to incent more apartment buildings because people want rentals. They don't want all these tiny little units. We need to create rental space that a family could live in. We haven't been doing that. So there's still a shortage in 3-bedroom units, for example. There's all these 1-bedrooms and studios and so on. So I think there's still policy work to be done. But actually, for the first time in a while, I'm encouraged that we have, I think now, the makings of both the political will to create more supply, add density, and we have lower interest rates, which are going to help buyers, and maybe and slower population growth. We have the recipe here where affordability might well improve a bit. And by the way, the US has seen a similar erosion in affordability. It's not just in Canada. One reason voters didn't like the Democrats, even though inflation in the US wasn't that high, is because the way the US measures inflation, they don't measure the cost of buying a house and what the mortgage is and so on. They leave that out. And if you put it in the way we do, their inflation would have actually looked quite a bit higher. So Americans were angry about high 30-year mortgage rates and the inability of their kids to move out, and they didn't want the 30-year-olds still living at home.
Right.
And so they too have a similar issue. It is not just a Canadian story. It is, in fact, many countries have seen the same sort of thing.
So Beata, we just have a few minutes left, but for my son who leaves home at 55 years old, will he, or I guess people who are leaving at 25, like is there the prospect on the horizon of a 25-year-old being able to afford a home? Because I think that's the crux of when people talk about my pocketbook, my affordability, like yes, food prices are super high, but also it's just the fact that no one I know who's in the 5 to 10 year age range younger than me can buy a house.
They just got to go to Gaspé, New Brunswick. And they can pick one up. So yeah, not in Toronto. And
even outside of Toronto, other markets as well.
And yes, but other provinces are not as pricey as we are in Ontario and BC. The issue on home ownership has never been an issue for those who are children of parents who are homeowners. The data shows that they will also be homeowners, not through the inheritance of their parents' home itself, but through the wealth transfer mechanism. And so we have a report on this if you're interested, that there's very strong data that we should not be overly fussed with those who have parents who are homeowners. They're likely going to be fine. They also learn through their parents about financing, mortgages, and so the financial literacy level is better in that situation. Those who are unlikely to be homeowners are the ones who don't already have parents who are homeowners. They don't build up wealth as quickly as homeowners. Think about your house, how much it's appreciated and the store of value that is, in addition to equity. If you only have one channel and that channel happens to be more volatile, you don't do as well or haven't done as well historically. And so one of our policy recommendations is when we're thinking about where to put that tax dollar and to have the most tax efficiency support that you can possibly get, if your goal is on home ownership, then it needs to be on those who don't have parents who are homeowners and don't have that store of value of wealth in the household. And that's affordability of home ownership. If it's affordability, meaning rental needs to be affordable, well, rental rates are declining, and that's now well documented. And so that side of the market is absolutely becoming more affordable, including in Toronto, in part because of what Avery's already talking about, which is this overabundance of supply and investors now having to discount rent rates. So The economics for investment have gone down, but it has certainly improved for those who are on the rental side of the market. So it really depends on the nuances of where you want to go. But if you want to keep your kid at home until they're 55, you're in the right market. You're good.
Sweet. Okay, on that note, I have to end it there, that we're out of time. I want to thank all of you for your time. Stéphane Marion, Francis Donald, Doug Porter, Beata Caranci, and Avery Schenfeld. Thank you all for your time as well. It's been a pleasure to share the stage with you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Whoa. Hi, my name is Balinder Alawali. I'm from Mastercard Canada. That was an incredibly important and poignant discussion, so thank you to all of our panelists. I really appreciated the solution-oriented interprovincial discussion, as well as the blue tie. I felt that was very relevant. I offset mine with a purple handkerchief, so we've got to keep it balanced. Before I jump into my formal remarks, I want to thank Stephanie and the Economic Club of Canada for hosting an important conversation, and to each of you for joining us today. This is always a great event, particularly one at the beginning of the year, the calendar year, which always helps to set the tone for us. Vashti, thank you for helping guide this conversation. We've seen you put politicians in the hot seat. It was kind of nice to see that live in action here today. And to our august panelists, thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. I think maybe Peter Mansbridge or other podcasters might be looking to have guests. It would be great to see you and hear you again. As we reflect on today's conversation, I walked away with a real cautious tone about what could be a challenging year. From managing elevated debt levels to the trade challenges, I was heartened to hear there may actually be a way through this, which I think was the thing that I walked away with. Remarkably and thankfully, our Mastercard Economics Institute did a yearly outlook at the end of 24 where we did get to touch on a number of these. So I was happy to hear that. Throughout 2025, our team of economists and data scientists will be watching how consumers shift their spending and interest rates and impact on the fiscal policy influencing decisions as we go to the rest of the year. We collect this data for our own analysis, but also to share with our partners and for the Canadian business community. So watch out for outputs from us further on that. We all recognize the economy is much more than just about short-term challenges and opportunities we face. It's also about ensuring Canadians build on their long-term prosperity. And I'm using the word prosperity deliberately in this instance. At Mastercard, we spent a lot of time thinking about how we can drive prosperity for Canadians with explicit goal of powering economies and empowering people. We are observing that traditional definition of prosperity is shifting from financial growth to a more holistic approach, health, well-being, and security included. Unfortunately, our research also shows us that Canadians are increasingly seeing this vision as unattainable. 1 in 4 Canadians believe future generations will be less prosperous than those before them. And why not? Look at what we've come through. High inflation we talked about today, high interest rates, high housing costs, 55-year-old children living at home. Like, this, terrifying. So how do we address this? Our research shows 65% of Canadians agree that advances in technology and innovation will make Canada more prosperous in the future, in addition to all the things that we discussed today. Our team at Mastercard is committed to a leadership role in driving prosperity in Canada by harnessing technology, innovation, and inclusivity to empower individuals and businesses. I'd like to think of this as our opportunity as business leaders to come together and set hope for the future for Canadians. We know Canadians are resilient. As a nation, we've come through the challenging times before. We've driven innovation in our workplaces, unlocked new industries, and built prosperity together. Let's continue to work together to use innovation to drive our inclusive economic growth that we all want and need. I'm always here to chat with any of you, and I hope you will join us on this journey. And with that, Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you, Belinda. So we know events like this one would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. So a big final thank you to our title sponsor today, CPAO, our presenting sponsor, Mastercard, and our event sponsor, the National Bank of Canada. Thank you to our host venue today, the Sheraton Toronto Centre. They always take such great care of us, especially with such an early morning start. Now, please mark your calendars for some of our upcoming events and conferences. On February the 12th, in Toronto, we will be hosting alongside Air Canada a very timely and relevant luncheon that should appeal to most of you in the audience today. How is our nation's largest airline helping Canadian businesses take flight? Mark Nasser, Executive Vice President, Marketing and Digital at Air Canada and President of Aeroplan, will explore how a thriving airline industry is empowering Canadian businesses to compete and succeed both locally and globally. This luncheon will showcase a keynote address as well as a panel discussion and will be something you don't want to miss. On February the 4th, which is World Cancer Day, the Economic Club of Canada, in conjunction with the Cancer Society, will be hosting a luncheon which will feature a panel of experts as they dig into the affordability of cancer care in Canada. So another very relevant and timely conversation. And finally, February the 18th, we are hosting Hotel Capital Connection. This full-day conference targets the capital side of hotel ownership. So if you've ever been interested in that, this is certainly something you won't want to miss. Our experts will explore current issues impacting the hotel investment community, along with future opportunities for growth in this space. You can find all the registration information on the Economic Club of Canada's website. So again, a final thank you to all of you who came out this morning. Thank you to Vashi and all of our economists. We will see you next year.